It is my true honor to have a great friend and colleague, Dr. Salles, here for this visiting professorship. Dr. Salles is a national leader in the research of diversity, inclusion, and equity. She trained at Stanford University, where our training overlapped, was a bit of an overachiever with not just getting a medical degree, but also a PhD in education. She then completed her residency at Stanford with myself, and we were chiefs, and she then completed a fellowship in minimally invasive surgery at Washington University in St. Louis. She stayed there on faculty and was just hired by Stanford back to continue her research by the Stanford Medical School. Dr. Salles is a true national leader in her research and focuses specifically on implicit bias, gender equity, various other topics, including harassment. I think one of the biggest things that I admire her for the most is not her numerous accolades with her publications and prolific scientific writer, like in JAMA Surgery and JAMA Networks, as well as in Time Magazine and Scientific America, and many numerous more to mention. But truthfully, there's many who complain, but I can tell you as a friend who's trained with her and has seen her, she truly cares, and that's what her soul is, and I think that's what really led to her success. She's always been there as a supporter, not for the younger generations, but generations like myself and above her, and I think that is what has really, truly made her special. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Salles.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just put this in here. Excellent. Thank you. So sometimes I make a joke about being a free-range speaker, but it never lands because I don't like to be stuck at the podium and then, you're in California, so you're like, oh, like the chickens, I also like to be free-range. But, right? Say it's funny, but nobody laughs. Anyway, but still I'm sharing it because I still think it's funny. Anyway, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you all for being here this early. When I give talks to medical audiences, their talks are at 12, which is really nice. And I was just at Hopkins 2 weeks ago giving grand rounds, and one of my collaborators who's at Hopkins said, I'm going to miss your talk because that's outside my work hours, because it was a 7 o'clock talk. Yeah. So anyway, thank you all for being here this early. I'm going to talk mostly obliquely about meritocracy, but really the whole subject today is about the ways in which the system that we live in and work in is not a meritocracy. I put it here as a question because you might disagree, and maybe by the end I will have convinced you that I'm right, but let me know. So I'm going to start with just a short little exercise here. If you could just take a minute, 20 seconds or so, close your eyes maybe, and envision what a physician looks like to you. I appreciate the people closing their eyes. Thank you for following instructions. So I did this Google search in November, I think, and here's what comes up. Anybody notice anything? It's a lot of white. Yeah, it's a lot of white people. Anything else? Yeah, a lot of older people. A lot of stethoscopes. Yeah, a lot of stethoscopes, which maybe hurts us as surgeons. We're like, wait, we're doctors too. And we don't obviously usually carry stethoscopes around our necks like that. There are a few women, but there aren't that many, and they tend to look like they're almost in subservient roles in most of these images, like they might be an assistant of some kind. There was a study like this where they looked at, or they asked students, there were psychology students and MBA students, to draw pictures of a leader. What does a leader look like? So to me, a physician in our system is the equivalent of a leader in business. And about a third of the time, people didn't draw a gendered picture, actually. They just drew some attributes or whatever. But of the ones that were gendered, 80% of those were men. And the point is not that anybody is bad, but it's that these are the ways that we are basically acculturated in at least in our Western culture, that most physicians are thought to be white men, and most leaders are also thought to be white men. And it's not because white men are good or bad or anything, it's just they tend to be the largest demographic. And so we all, when we are conjuring up these images, most of us will tend to think of people like that. Now, of course, some people might say, well, all the doctors I had when I was growing up were women, and so I thought of a woman. Great. It's not a rule. It's just a tendency. And then you might say, okay, well, so what? What does it really matter? What comes up on a Google search? What does it really matter? What people are drawing in a classroom? How does that affect my life or anyone else's life for that matter? And the argument I'm going to make to you today is that the reason it matters is that when it's time to nominate people for an award or to select a speaker or to ask somebody to chair a committee, then what most of us are thinking of are people who look a certain way. And part of that is that most of the people who are in the rooms making those decisions also look that same way. And it's, again, not anybody's malicious intent. It's just if I happen to be a white man or even just a man of any color, probably most of the people in my professional network are also going to be men. And so when I have to think about who I'm going to nominate for something, I just sit around and think about who's in my network. They happen to look like me, right? And the reason that's problematic is that then those are opportunities that people who look differently, so people of color and women, aren't getting. And of course, these are opportunities that we need for promotion. So this is just to show you some actual numbers. Now, these are data from the AAMC, which show that we have, as we all know in this room, quite a few women at the medical student level. In fact, this year was the first year that across the 4 years of medical school, we have more women in medical school now in this country than we have men. But as you go up through the ranks and you get to full professor, 21%, right? Deans, 16% are women. Traditionally, the argument has been, well, it just takes time. There haven't been women going into medicine for all that long, and if we just wait long enough, we'll have enough women making their way up through this pipeline. So it might surprise you to know that actually women have been 45% or more of medical school classes since the late 1990s. So this isn't a new phenomenon of women going into medicine. We've been doing it for a long time. And it shouldn't take, you would think that's at least enough time to get to full professor, at least I would think. These numbers are similar in surgery, by the way. We're about 25% for assistant professor and about 10% for full, so lower. But the same issue of we've got now almost 40% of surgical residents are women. So what's happening? I'm going to talk about two things that I think are at play here. Obviously, like anything else in life, there are many, many factors, and we don't have time to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk today about bias and harassment, and then what the impact of those things is, and some possible solutions. So sometimes people will say to me, does any of this really matter? We're not here to talk about skin color or gender. We're here to take care of patients, and that's really all that matters, right? And 100% I agree, we're all here to take care of patients. But the thing is that all of these factors that impede the advancement of certain groups of people ultimately affect patient care. Beyond that, I actually think it matters that when people feel excluded, their feelings are hurt. I think that matters. Some people say, we are all adults. There's no crying in baseball. Get over it. And that's fine, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I will tell you that the data suggests that when people don't feel like they belong or they don't feel like they fit in, they have higher absenteeism, they're less engaged with the work that they do, and they're more likely to leave. So I do think that even if you don't care about feelings, all of that will affect your bottom line. On the other side of things, what's good about diversity, when we do have diversity, true diversity, is that outcomes are better. So when we look at businesses, we know that companies that have more diversity on their boards have greater return on investment, greater revenues, more innovation. Papers that are published by more diverse group of authors are published in higher impact journals, so even in academics, we find this to be true. There was a video that I'm not going to have time to show you today, but you can look it up. It's called HP Computers Are Racist, and it's about 2 minutes of just hilarity. But basically, HP had created these facial recognition computers about 10 years ago. And they were supposed to, they were cameras, facial recognition cameras. And they're supposed to follow your face. I don't know why, honestly. I don't know why we need that in life. But that's what was supposed to happen. But it only worked if your face was light. And so there's this video of a dark-skinned guy, and he's doing this, and the camera's not moving. And then his friend, he calls White Wanda, comes in. When White Wanda comes in, the camera's moving. Anyway, so the point of that is, what happens when you don't have diversity on your team? is you don't think about how your products are working for people who look different from you. There was a hand gel dispenser that was made, we all use this every day, right? Gel in, gel out, that came out about 1.5 years ago that didn't recognize dark skin. Same thing, it's hard to imagine you end up with a product like that if you had anybody of color on your team, right? So those are some of the ways that diversity can actually help improve outcomes. And in fact, we know in healthcare, it's hard to combine the bias and the harassment because there's so much stuff to talk about. But we know that in healthcare, people like to be taken care of by people who look like them. And there's several studies, one of which I'll show you later, that suggests that women provide at least as good, if not better, medical and surgical care as men. And that when black men are taken care of by black physicians, they're more likely to elect for preventative care measures. So it really does matter in healthcare as well, because you might be sitting there going, well, we're not making computers and cameras, and what does this have to do with us? But it's all the same, is what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, so if you believe that maybe this all matters and that we should have diverse teams, you might think, okay, well, so what is this bias thing? Everybody's talking about it these days, right? Even it comes up in our national politics. If anybody remembers, in 2016, actually, Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in one of the national debates. And I was sitting at home, I was like, what? Somebody's talking about implicit bias on a big stage. It was amazing. Now people are talking about it a lot. So what is it and how do we measure it? Look, nobody really knows how to measure it. I'll be honest with you. People will talk about this test a lot. I'm talking about it today. And the reason is that it's the test that has the most amount of data behind it. It's been on this website, implicit.harvard.edu, for over 10 years, I think maybe 15-ish years, and was used as a research tool before this website existed. It's not a perfect, like you take this IAT, that's what they're called, implicit association tests. It's not like you take it and you're good for life. Our biases change with the mood, with the day, with whatever's happened to us. The retest reliability is not 100% on these things, but they can give you a sense of what's going on. And basically the way they work is they are using reaction times. So the simplest thing to do to describe it to you is to go back to the very first one, which was looking at insects and flowers and whether they're good or bad. And the way the test works, in that particular example, it'll show you words that are good, and it'll say, okay, hit a key on this side of the keyboard. Then it'll show you words that are bad, and it'll say, hit a key on this side of the keyboard. Then it'll show you insects and say, hit a key on this side of the keyboard when you see an insect, and then flowers, hit a key on this side of the keyboard when you see flowers. Then it'll combine those things, and it'll say, okay, if you see either a word that's good or a flower, hit a key over here. Or if you see a word that's bad or an insect, hit a key over here. And for most of us, that's pretty easy, because most of us don't really love insects, and most of us do like flowers. So you go, okay, that's easy, I can do that. Then in the last trial, they switch it up, and they say, okay, if you see an insect or a word that's good, click over here. And if you see a flower or a word that's bad, click over here. That tends to be a little bit more challenging for most of us, so it takes just a few microseconds longer to do, typically. And the test then just takes the differences in the reaction times in those last two trials and says, okay, you are biased toward flowers, right? And you go, great, I love flowers. They have created now these IATs for all sorts of traits: age, race, gender, obesity, religion, almost anything you can think of. So you can go to this website, take them, they're kind of fun. It takes about maybe 5-ish minutes to do one of them. Okay, what does that have to do with us today? So we looked at the results for this IAT for healthcare workers. So I'm going to show you results from 2 different IATs. The first one is the gender career IAT. And the basic idea of that one is instead of insects and flowers, we have men and women. We have male, female. And then we have career or family. So this questioning how quickly we associate men or women with career or family. And it's a binary test. I want to acknowledge that limitation. It's always been designed to be binary, so we're not looking at any other gender identifications. So we looked at that test. The gender career IAT has been on the implicit website for a long time. So we looked at 11 years worth of data, and we looked at people who self-identified as being in healthcare. And we wanted to know, what are the biases of people within healthcare? Because that's the environment that we're all working in, right? And then we created a second IAT, which was surgery specific, and we had surgeons take it. So not the broad healthcare sample, but just surgeons. And it was looking at male and female, and then surgery or family medicine. So here's what we found on the implicit, again, based on the reaction times. What we found was that both men and women within healthcare associate men with careers and women with family. And surgeons, both men and women, associate men with surgery and women with family medicine. So that helps understand a little bit, right, why when someone looking like me walks into a room, everyone's like, are you the nurse? Are you the RT? Are you the OT? Are you anything but the surgeon? It's just the biases that we carry. So we also ask people in these IATs explicitly what they think, right? I just want to make a little side point here that this whole talk, this part is about implicit bias. I'm not talking about explicit bias or racism or sexism, which still very much exists. So I'm not suggesting that that stuff doesn't matter or it doesn't happen anymore. It's just not the focus of today's talk. But when we ask people explicitly, do they associate men with careers and do they associate men with surgery? Again, both men and women, both in the broad healthcare sample and within the surgery sample, say yes. I associate men with careers. I associate women with families. I associate men with surgery. I associate women with family medicine. So even explicitly, this is a bias that people are holding and admitting to. Okay, so you might say, okay, well, people are biased. What are we to do about that? And we're all adults. We're all trying to do the right thing. For sure, that bias doesn't affect the work that we do. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this bias affects opportunities for women specifically. So this was a study by Julie Silver and her colleagues at Harvard. They looked at a lot of different awards. So 14 awards from 11 societies, 7 specialties, including specialties that have a decent number of women, like dermatology, anesthesia, neurology, PM&R. And they just looked at the gender of the winner of the award. So this is the first part of their data, which is from 1945 to 1967. The black dots are awards that were given to men. That one empty circle there is an award that was given to a woman. Where there's empty space, like all here, that's just a year that award wasn't given out. So you see back in the 40s and 50s, a lot of these awards weren't given out. So let's fast forward to 1968 to 2017. Right, you already see the point of the slide. But you might say, there got to be some women in there, right? And indeed, that's it. Those are all the women. So 14 awards from 11 societies and 7 specialties, 72 years, 9 women selected. And the point of the study is to say, does that seem like that could happen by chance? Does it really seem like we could not have identified in all those years more than 9 women who were qualified to win these awards? It seems unlikely, right? And in fact, I think there's some statistical analysis that's super, super unlikely to happen by chance. And again, it's not that people who were selecting these awards or nominating people for these awards are maliciously trying to hold down the women. Most people are not doing that. But they're just not thinking about women, and they're not intentionally trying to lift up and amplify and elevate women. And so this is what we find. Okay, you say, well, but that's not us, and who cares about awards anyway? Okay, speaking opportunities. That's another thing that really matters, right? I think we can all agree that matters on your CV when you're going up for promotion, because you have to show that you have a national reputation. So we looked at 14 surgical societies, and we looked at, for each one, 2 different years of their meeting, their annual meeting. And we looked at the plenary speaking opportunities, and we looked at their panels. So on the left side, you see the plenary speaking opportunities. So you have societies A through N, and for each society, you have 2 bars, one for 2011, one for 2016. The pink portions of the bars are women speakers, and the blue are the men. Little black lines are the percentage of women in the society for that year. So let me just help you out. Half the time, 50% of the time, there were 0 women as plenary speakers at these meetings. Half the time. A third of the societies had 0 women in both of the years that we looked at. Then on the right side, we have the panels, manels. So manels are, right, people love that term. So manels are 2 or more speakers, the way we defined it in our study, 2 or more speakers, all of whom are men. And what we found was across these societies, 40% of all panels were manels. And you can see some societies, like Society B there, 100% manels both years. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Okay, so, but you also have, let's not forget, oh, sorry, wrong thing. Here, society H, 0% males both years. So we had quite a lot of variability in the amount of effort that societies were making here. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, fine, I get it. Women aren't getting the awards. Women aren't speaking. But you know what? We are really here to award those who are qualified. And if women aren't cutting it, what am I supposed to do? This isn't charity, right? I'm not going to invite people who are not qualified to give a talk. I need my meeting to be high quality. Why would I give an award to someone who doesn't deserve it? And I am right there with you. There's data that suggests that that's not actually what's happening. So there's been a number of studies looking at CVs where basically all they do is they take the same exact CV and they change the name at the top. And they send it out to job applications. And it turns out that if the name at the top is John, John is much more likely to get called back for an interview and to get hired than is Jane, with the exact same CV. And they've done this also with ethnic names, and those who have names that sound like they might be Black or African American are also less likely to get called for an interview. So it's hard to make an argument that that's about quality of the person, right? If you've taken out the quality variable because everybody's the same, then you're left with the one thing that's different, which is their gender or their race. And the orchestra studies, which now have been made famous because I think Gladwell wrote about them, really showed the same thing. So women were not getting selected into orchestras. There were very few women. And then what did they do? Anybody know? Yeah, they put up a curtain. And then women were 25% more likely to get selected. So again, that suggests that it's not about the actual quality of the performance. It's about how we're judging that performance based on what we know about the person. And we find the same thing in medicine when we look at grants and letters of recommendation. So for grants, there have been a few studies looking at how people write the reviews for the grants based on the gender of the person who's applying. So when the PI is a woman, people are less likely to use words like outstanding, innovator, leader than they are when the PI is a man. In addition, when you look at grants that are funded, so theoretically should be about the same level of quality, it turns out that the reviews for the grants of women who are funded tend to have more of those outstanding terms in them. In other words, women's grants had to be that much better to get funded than were those of the men. In letters of recommendation, they tend to be shorter for women, and they have more doubt inducers. So things like, she seems like a great surgeon, student, whatever level you're talking about. I think that she's committed. I think that she's talented. Whereas for the men, they tend to say things like, is a true leader. Bound to be a leader in academic surgery. Those types of not qualified statements. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 studies that have come out in the last couple of years looking at the outcomes for patients and whether the care that they receive from women is different from the care that they receive from men. This is just one. This is looking at Medicare data. And they looked at 8 different common diagnoses for hospitalization. So they're looking at hospitalist data, so like pneumonia and CHF. And they looked at the 30-day readmission, 30-day mortality. And they found that regardless of how sick the patients were, regardless of what diagnosis they looked at, those who were cared for by women did better. And the kind of big punchline from this study that got quoted a lot at the time was that if all the patients had been taken care of by women, 30,000 more patients would have been alive that year. The point of this is not to say, actually, that I think women are better doctors or surgeons, but it's to suggest, again, that we're not seeming like we're performing worse. And so why are we getting left out of things all the time? By the way, you might say, okay, that's hospitalist data. What does that have to do with us? There was a study that was done on surgeons in Canada that looked at, I think it was 20 or 25 different procedures and looked at the gender of the surgeons and found that, in particular for mortality, the patients who were taken care of by women had lower 30-day mortality risk than those who were taken care of by men. One other thing I want to draw your attention to is something called the double bind, which affects women pretty much every day. And the basic idea of it is that there are a certain set of qualities that are thought of as leadership qualities. So if you think back to the beginning, when we were talking about what does a physician look like or what does a leader look like, there's certain characteristics like being assertive and being decisive that we think of as leadership qualities. Then there's a set of qualities that we think of as being more feminine, which some people will call communal, which is being kind, gentle, and nurturing. And the reason I mention all this is that when either men or women act in discordance with these expectations, they pay a social penalty. And for most men, not all, but for most men, being kind of more decisive and assertive is within their natural inclination. And so most men aren't facing this double bind all that often. But for women, in medicine and in surgery in particular, when we are asked really to be assertive and to be confident, then when we behave that way, we are judged for doing that because that goes against the gender expectation that people have for how a woman should behave. So even Taylor Swift gets this. Yeah. And if you imagine Taylor Swift, I mean, can anyone say she's not successful? Super successful, made tons of money, won all sorts of awards. And even she says that if she were a man, she'd be a fearless leader, an alpha type, when everyone believes you. What's that like? I'm so sick of running as fast as I can, wondering if I'd get there quicker if I was a man. And I'm so sick of them coming at me again, because if I was a man, then I'd be the man. And I put this up there because if Taylor Swift feels this way, just imagine what mere mortals, like those of us in this room, are feeling like when we're walking around the hospital trying to get things done, and we're labeled difficult, troublemaker, B-word. I'm sure you've all heard these things, just because we're trying to take care of patients. I want to get to the harassment stuff, so I just put this in here because I had taken the double bind stuff out, but last night at dinner it came up and seemed like people really wanted this point to be made. So I'm going to go quickly through this so I can get to the harassment stuff, but I'm going to do just the first two studies here. The first one was how this plays out. So there was a international engineering firm that surveyed all of their employees, and they asked them about other employees, and they asked them about their own sense of confidence. And what they found was that for men, the more confidence they had, the more influence they had within the organization, which makes sense. For women, the more confidence they had, the less influence they had within the organization, unless they exhibited something they called pro-social behaviors. What are pro-social behaviors? It's saying things like, how are you today? How can I help you accomplish what you would like to do? What is important to you, etc. And no one's saying that's bad. We should probably all be doing those things. But when women don't do that, there's a penalty. And when men don't do that, it's totally fine. So that's extra work that women are expected to do in order to have influence. The second one here is about anger. So how people perceive the expression of anger coming from women versus men. So this was done using videos where they had people reading the same script, actors, is either a man or a woman, expressing anger at a colleague. They had been assigned to meet with a client, and the colleague had messed up the date or time that they were supposed to meet with the client, bungled the meeting, they lost the client. So the person in the video was just expressing anger and frustration that this has happened. Then they asked people watching the video to answer some questions about what they saw. When the person in the video was a man, they said, well, I mean, surely he was justified in expressing anger because this person really messed things up and cost them the account. When the person in the video was a woman, they said, well, why she gotta be so angry? She seems like an angry person. They made an internal attribution to what kind of person she was, rather than thinking that perhaps she was put in a situation that justified the reaction she was having. Anyone experience this in real life? I know, nobody's brave enough. Yeah, it's happened. And we'll skip that last one. Okay, so we're going to shift gears now and talk about sexual harassment. The most important thing that I want you to get out of this is that sexual harassment is about power. It's not about sex. It's not about attraction. It's about power. And that's why I put power differential at the bottom of this pyramid. When there is no power differential, very hard to have harassment. But when there is a hierarchy, or there is some other, title or whatever that attributes power to people differently, that's when we can have harassment. The next point I want you to remember is that gender harassment, sexual attention, and coercion are all different types of harassment. And the reason I say that is that gender harassment is things like, oh, women can be doctors now? Or not having the instruments that the woman surgeon needs, even though they always have whatever the man surgeon needs. That's gender harassment. That's sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is not just somebody grab my bottom, grab my breast. That's assault. Okay? Unwanted sexual attention is about appearance and physicality often, or desire. That's how people will those are the comments that people will make. But again, it's all about power, making the other person feel less than. And then sexual coercion is, if you sleep with me, I will put you as an author on this paper, or I will make you the chair of this committee, or whatever. And as you can see, it's the smallest triangle, because luckily that happens the least of all the things. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine put out a report 2 years ago that goes into great detail on sexual harassment. And I think this is one of the most useful graphics from that report, which shows you that gender harassment is all the stuff down here under the water on the iceberg. So nude images posted, sexually humiliating acts, sexual insult, like for a good time call, offensive remarks about bodies, sexist insults, women don't belong in science, etc. Those are the vast majority of the harassment issues that arise actually in the workplace, are the things that are under the water. Then you have up above the things that a lot of people automatically think of: groping, sexual assault, rape, quid pro quo. And in their report, they really explored what's happening in our workplaces, what's happening in our universities that's leading these things to happen. By the way, they found that up to 50% of medical students had experienced sexual harassment, and over 50% of women faculty in medicine had experienced sexual harassment. So these are a couple take-home points that conditions that there are some conditions that make harassment more likely to occur, and these environments can silence and limit the career opportunities for targets of sexual harassment and their bystanders. The consequence of this is significant and costly loss of talent. It appears that women are often bullied or harassed out of career pathways in these fields. So back to that graphic of the pipeline, that's what they're talking about. They're saying, here's what's happening. People are getting harassed and they're choosing to leave. And so what are those factors in the environment that make it more likely for people to experience harassment? Male-dominated, this is from the NASA report. So male-dominated environments are more likely to have harassment in them. Places where there's a strict hierarchy, I would argue we have that in surgery. Places where there's tolerance, where people just see it and walk right by, which happens in medicine. And I'll say it happens in medicine partially because it happens so often. There is so much harassment going on. If you actually pay attention, it's happening every day. Who can fight that? We cannot fight every instance of these things that happens. And so a lot of times we're taking care of patients, we prioritize our patients, and we just say, I cannot deal with this now. I've got to just put my head down. But that contributes to this problem. And then being isolated, being the only resident in a room with an attending, let's say in the OR, or when you're rounding, or seeing a consult in the ED, being isolated is another factor. So I wrote about this for Scientific American, and I put this up here just to say that I think that this is my take, that this is the problem, that it happens so much in medicine that we just have gotten used to it. This is what normal is for us, that people will call us sweetie. We were talking about this last night. People will question our age, our qualifications. Are we really the surgeon? This happens all the time. That's the gender harassment stuff. But even beyond that, we get far more severe comments from patients, not infrequently, and we just brush it aside, brush it aside, brush it aside. And I think that we need to have a little bit more, or a little bit less tolerance. And that means all of us, including the people who are the targets, but also the people who are seeing it happen, because often bystanders are in a greater position of power to intervene. So this was a study that came out in the New England Journal this fall, where they surveyed all surgery residents, general surgery residents after the app site, which is, to me, a methodological concern. But anyway, they did it. And they asked about all sorts of different negative experiences that people can have. And the most important thing here is that 70% of women had been mistreated in one way or another. Number one, 70%. And the next most important thing is that the most common people who were the perpetrators of these negative behaviors were patients and their families and attendings, with a few exceptions, which are nurses here. 24% of the perpetrators of gender discrimination against women were nurses, and then nurses here, that 23% of the times that men were sexually harassed, it was by nurses. So basically, patients and their families, attendings, and nurses, which is most of the people we encounter, right? So it's coming from kind of all directions. And what are the consequences of that? So I alluded to this earlier. When people are harassed, they have less engagement with the job, they have less job satisfaction, they're more likely to withdraw, and there are mental and physical health consequences as well. So note here on intersectionality, I've kind of mentioned race a couple times today. It was not the focus to talk about race, but I just want to note that when people have more than one marginalized identity that they carry, there are likely to be more severe consequences. So that could be a person who's a woman and a person of color, or who's a woman and has a disability, or any number of things that you can think of that are two or more underrepresented identities that a person can carry. And I mention this because, one, it's important. We've spent a lot of time historically looking at outcomes for white women and not taking into account these other factors, and that needs to change. And so, two, to say, anyone out there who's doing research in these areas, we should be thinking more along these lines so that we can understand exactly how much worse it is and what we need to do to provide support differently for people who carry more than one marginalized identity. Okay, so the impact of all of this stuff, though, in the end, you say, okay, we've talked about lots of stuff. We talked about harassment. We talked about bias. We talked about speaking. But what's the bottom line? So the bottom line is those who experience bias and harassment and women in general are less likely to be promoted into leadership positions. We're less likely to get speaking opportunities. We're less likely to get our work published. We're less likely to get promoted. We get paid less. I don't usually talk about that because it's kind of the most accepted of the things, so I don't feel like I need to deal with it, but we get paid less. And so the consequences, we're rational creatures, and we look at what's going on around us, and we leave. Obviously, plenty of people stay, and we're lucky to have people who do stay. But again, going back to that pipeline, I think this is what happens. People look around and say, this isn't the type of work environment I want to be in. I'm going to go find one that seems more equitable to me. Okay, so what can we do? In the last few minutes, literally everyone in this room can do the things that are on this slide. You don't have to have a title. You don't have to have power. You don't have to have a position that means anything, really, but you just have to be a human. So you can amplify women. So when we are in meetings, who is a woman in this room has been interrupted in a meeting? Right? You can just say, it doesn't matter, again, what your position is. You can say, oh, can we go back to Julie's idea? I was really interested in hearing what she was saying. Right? So we can do that. And we can amplify women by amplifying their successes, so their publications, awards, et cetera. You know, most departments have some sort of email listserv, something about accomplishments. It turns out that men are more likely to self-promote. Men are more comfortable with it. Women are not that comfortable with it, and we get judged for it when we do. So it's nice if someone other than that person can say, hey, did you see that Dr. Gholami just got this award at the AAS? It's better coming from someone else than it is coming from her, and that's the sad truth. So we can amplify women that way. We can give credit to people. You know, academic environments are very competitive, right? There's the sense that only a certain number of people can get through to whatever full professor, assistant or associate professor, or to get keynote speaking opportunities, whatever. And so there's a tendency sometimes to want to take credit for things that we maybe were not totally responsible for. And I would suggest that I think there's room for everyone to have their own success, and we can actually give credit to the people who do the majority of the work, because what success looks like for me is different from what it looks like for her. And so my success doesn't take away from hers, and hers doesn't take away from mine. I know it's sometimes hard to remember, but that's a point that I really believe in. Not assuming what other people want to do. So sometimes I hear people having conversations about an opportunity, and they'll say things like, well, but Julie just had a baby. I don't think she's going to want to do that. Or so-and-so's parent is sick. Maybe this isn't the right time. But it turns out that the person who's fully capable of making that decision is Julie, and not anyone else who's debating about whether to ask her or not. So it's all out of kindness when we're trying to not put pressure on people, but we're all adults, and people are capable of saying, thank you so much for thinking of me. This isn't the right time, if it's indeed not the right time. But we shouldn't make those decisions for other people. We can avoid mansplaining, which is explaining people's experiences to them. We can avoid for appropriation, which is another thing that many of us have probably seen. You're in a meeting, a woman mentions an idea, nobody really pays attention, and then 2 minutes later, John says the same thing. All of a sudden, it's a great idea, right? So that's for appropriation. For hiring, I won't go through all of these in detail, but one thing we can do in terms of knowing our biases, yes, you can take the IET, but I told you it's not perfect, and so you're probably not going to spend your time that way. But what you can do, I mean, you might, it's good. It's a worthy exercise, actually. But what you can do is if you interact with someone and you walk away, because we interact with so many people, you walk away thinking, oh, I didn't like that person. You can think about what about that person did you not like? Was it that actually that person said something inappropriate or unethical? Or was it that it was a woman who was speaking to you directly and you didn't really appreciate that? Or was it the tone? And this is for both men and women. We all have this same reaction. Blinded review. So back to the orchestra studies, we know that blinded review seems to decrease our ability for our biases to creep into our decision making. That, by the way, is what all of these are about. It's not about getting rid of our biases, because I don't think that we can do that, but it's managing them and minimizing them. So not having the names associated to the extent that we can. Standardizing interviews is a big one. In medicine, most of the time, we're talking to people to see if they are like us or if they will fit in. And I know why we do that. But at the same time, the more we do that, the more we're selecting for people who look just like us. And then we're not going to be able to get more diversity. And having people do a work sample test is, again, another way to take your own bias out of it. Because if you're looking for someone who can do anesthesia, so maybe you ask them about a few anesthetic agents. Or if you're looking for someone who's going to do surgery, maybe you have them do manual dexterity tests. Or decision making, whatever it is. The thing that's hard, and the reason people don't do this, is you have to think ahead of time, what are the things that we really need in the person that we're trying to hire? And then you have to build something around those qualities and those skills that you're looking for. And the last thing that I want to point out here is that we really have to track outcomes. This is just like anything else. Like you change your DVT prophylaxis or you change your preoperative antibiotic. You wouldn't do that and not see what happens next, right? You need to track your outcomes and see if you had the effect that you were looking for. On this one, I'm going to skip most of it except to say updating policies. So anyone know how long pregnancy's been around? Long while, yeah, like our entire human race. And yet, when people have a baby, it's like, oh my God, what do we do? How much time can we get them? And how's that going to work? And what about the schedule? And it's like a one-on-one negotiation between the person who's having the baby and their supervisor. And I truly am not sure why that is. Because we take people, especially when you look at training, you take people in their peak fertility years, and then you know you're going to be with them, you know how long they're going to be with you, right? And then you go, oh my God, you're having a baby? How unpredictable, right? So we can update our policies and recognize that there are women in the workforce. They're going to have babies. They should be able to have babies. We should have maternity leave policies. We should have lactation rooms available, et cetera, et cetera. That's the main thing on that one. I'm going to leave this one up, which is the difference between equality and equity. This is from the Robert Johnson Foundation. A lot of times people think that having, say, different policies for different types of people or having different types of accommodations isn't fair. I hear that sometimes. So that mindset is the equality mindset, that no matter what anybody comes in with, no matter what their skills or past background, they should just get the same bike. Everyone has to ride the bike. If you can't ride the bike, you're not going to go down this path. Whereas equity, the idea is that actually people do come in with different abilities and skills and backgrounds, and that our job as any organization is to help those people succeed and to be able to do the job that we hired them for. And that might involve giving them a tricycle, it might involve giving them a reclining bike, and it might involve giving them a standard road bike. But it's not one size fits all. So that's it for me. Thank you.
I have to say that you bring up so many important questions, conversations that are part of all of our everyday existence. This is what's amazing, as you say, is this is not new. We have time for some questions. There's a lot here. Who wants to raise questions?
Back that way.
Go ahead. Let's start in the back.
Hi, I'm John, so common male name, John.
Yeah, so you're getting hired. You're getting hired all the time.
So the problem with implicit bias, a lot of it is unconscious, and it's without malicious intent initially. So how can one just kind of become more conscious of, hey, I have this implicit bias. It's not necessarily malicious intent, but it is like kind of dictating where I go without my explicit knowledge. Like, how do you kind of make that first step of being aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can take the IAT if you want and see where you stand on certain things based on that test.
So let's just ask a question right
Yeah.
there. How many people have taken that test and know what she's talking about?
Oh, look at that. Pretty good.
That is impressive.
Pretty good.
I do think, even though it's not perfect, if you haven't done it, I think it's useful to just ask yourself these questions.
Yeah. But I also think one of the points I made right near the end of like when you have an interaction with somebody and you walk away, displeased, to reflect on why, because a lot of times, I mean, look, I would say no one is really showing up to work trying to do a bad job. No one woke up in the morning saying I'm going to be the worst nurse anybody ever saw today, or I'm going to be the worst ICU doctor anybody ever had. Nobody's trying to do that, right? So people, I truly believe, are showing up doing the very best that they can. Sometimes the best that they can do is not great because of whatever other circumstances are going on. But people are trying. And so when you think someone is maybe not trying or you are frustrated with someone, you can reflect, take yourself out of it for a second, reflect on the conversation that you just had with that person and wonder, if that person in speaking to you looked differently, would you have walked away with the same impression or not? I think that's kind of where we're at. Institutionally and organizationally, there are all those types of things that were on these last couple slides that people can put in place to try to basically interrupt our own biases, because what we know is that we can't really do it ourselves. We've been trying for a long time. Again, I don't think that most people are out there trying to discriminate either. Yet, despite people's best intentions, we haven't really made progress on almost any of this stuff. There's a great paper from Molly Carnes, who's an internist at University of Wisconsin, Madison, that was published 20 years ago that outlines almost exactly the same things that I'm talking about today for women in medicine. And why is that? Because we relied on intention. So I think we have to do more than that and create structures that will allow us to behave in more equitable ways. Yeah.
I enjoyed your talk, Arghavan. Thanks for coming. I run a division where I think about 50%, 50-50, men and women. And I live in a house where it's 50-50 surgeons for both men and women. I hear stories almost every day about what the women surgeon in my both personal and professional life have to deal with and struggle with. And it truly can be overwhelming and deflating in many ways. And so I have two questions. As someone who is a man and who experiences, what's your advice to me in my leadership role to try and help move things along? And then my second question for you as a national leader in this is how would you define progress? I think it's very clear that we've struggled as an organization and as an institution and perhaps even as a society in general to address this. What do you see as progress and what are your hopes?
I'm going to do that second one first. So I think a lot of times people think that hiring people who are women or people of color is like a checkbox, like we're done. We hired a bunch of women, now we've got whatever percentage, and we feel really good about it. Unfortunately, that's just the diversity part of it, which only gets us so far. You can't really make progress without that. It's like a necessary but not sufficient condition. So the next step beyond that is creating an inclusive environment. A lot of times what happens in medicine, there was a study that showed this, is that people maybe get admitted to medical school or their residency or they get hired because they bring this different background, and yet when they show up to work, they're expected to stifle that difference. So when people's ideas are different, they're often labeled as a troublemaker or as someone who's difficult, and that is exactly what you don't want. That's creating a not inclusive environment, and this is why in surgery, what I see a lot when I go to different places is the same thing. hire a lot of young women as surgical faculty, and they leave, and there are very few senior women as surgical faculty. And I think that's part of why, again, there are lots of reasons. This is all very complicated stuff, but I think that's part of it, is that you hire, hopefully step one is you hire people who look different so that you can learn from each other, improve the quality of care that we provide. But step two is then really value what those people are saying once you've hired them, because if you don't, you might as well not have hired them to begin with. So that's that one. What you can do, literally anyone in this room can do, is to be a little less judgmental if we can. People are very quick to judge women. The study I didn't talk about on the double-blind slide was basically when anyone makes a mistake and they're in a gender incongruent role. So if it's a man as a nanny, for example, or if it's a woman as a surgeon, that person gets judged much more harshly. And we can try to roll that back a little bit. I think one of the ways it plays out for physicians, women physicians, is reports like getting written up by different people in the hospital, which happens more to the women than it does to the men, and often is non-substantive. It's basically, I didn't like her. So someone who's in a leadership role can choose how to handle that type of write-up, right? You could go to the person who was written about and say, gosh, I can't believe you were mean to this person, or whatever, right? You could do that. Or you could say, I wonder what happened in this interaction that led this person to not like you. Can you tell me more about what happened? And I know that that's dirtier, and I know that a lot of people don't want to get involved, but especially in the operating room, we know that women surgeons are not getting treated the same way as our male colleagues. We're not getting the instruments that we need. We're asking 3 or 4 times to get something put in our hand. And so sometimes we will say something more forcefully because we're not being heard, and now all of a sudden we're unprofessional. And so I think a leader who can recognize that this is a challenge that we face, and that it's not necessarily that we aren't being professional, but rather that we're being put in a very difficult situation because we're trying to take care of a patient and do the best that we can for that patient with a team that's not necessarily responding and doing their role appropriately. So I think that can go a long way in just validating the experiences and trying to support women who are really just trying to do our best and provide the best possible care. There's one back there and one over here.
I think that there's a lot of talk about what everyone can do to better support the people experiencing discrimination and whatnot, but I'm a pretty firm believer that people will do what you tolerate. And I think a lot of times as women or African Americans, we tolerate a lot. Mm-hmm. And the burden of discrimination shouldn't be on the person receiving that. However, are there any tools for those people that are experiencing that discrimination and how to not tolerate it, and what you should do in those situations to basically shape the behavior of those that are doing it?
Yeah, I think the only tools really that are described are around, or that I'm most aware of, are around microaggressions, but it's the same type of thing, I think, at any level. So Amalia Cochran, Madeline Torres, and myself wrote a paper in JAMA Surgery last year that goes through like some of the different frameworks for how to respond. But the basics are like, by the way, if you haven't read Difficult Conversations or Crucial Conversations, I highly recommend both of those. But the basic idea is, I feel this when you say or do that, and it affects me in this way. Here's how I would like to move forward. Something like that. The main idea is to be respectful, to not assign blame, to use I statements, and to inquire about where that person was coming from. A lot of times, not always, especially with patients, I think it's a little bit different, but a lot of times people didn't mean it to come off the way that it did, and they don't even realize it. But another decision that has to be made is, well, one, is it worth bringing it up? Because again, we see this stuff all the time. You can't really try to fight every single instance. And sometimes if you're only going to interact with a person once, forget it and move on, right? Because it's not worth it. But if there are people who are going to be in your daily life and it's worth saying something, then that's the first decision. Okay, it's worth saying something. Then when? Because sometimes right when it happened is not the time. Because either one, you're really upset and so you're not going to have a productive conversation, or two, there are a lot of people around, it's going to be embarrassing for that person and it's not going to go anywhere because they're going to get defensive. So sometimes you say, okay, here's this thing that happened. It's really upsetting to me. I'm going to wait on it until I have a time. Maybe I'm going to set up a meeting with that person. I'm going to go grab a coffee with that person, whatever. Or maybe even invite another person around as a buffer. That's another way to do it. But also, anyone who witnesses an interaction that's negative actually can say something. Sometimes it's easier for the person who's not the target to speak up and say, oh, what did you mean by that? Or, can you just say that again? Not sure I heard you correctly. Even that can be enough for people to be like, oh, maybe what I said wasn't quite right. And so again, sometimes bystanders are better equipped to say something. But I agree with you. I mean, we all can be empowered to say things. It's just a matter of when is the right time, and is it worth it with every person? No, but sometimes it is. Someone you're going to have an ongoing relationship with, and you want to say something, you got to find the right time, and then use I statements and try to understand where they're coming from and explain what the consequence of their behavior was for you.
So I've been in academic surgery since 1989. And you touched on it briefly with the bro appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get away from getting it to the point when you know something needs to be done, but the only way you see it happening is that you have to make the guys think it's their idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. I think that strategy of making someone else think that something is their idea is a very, very effective strategy, right? And that's why people do it. And we were talking about this last night at dinner too, that a lot of times people, at least a couple of years ago, if you think back to Lean In and kind of what people were saying, people were constantly saying women should XYZ. Women should negotiate more. Women should stand up for themselves. Women should self-promote. All of these things. And the reason that we don't is that there are penalties to be paid when we do. And so that's the same thing, is that sometimes, look, I don't think there's a way around it. I think sometimes if you really want something done and you're not in the position to get it done, then that is the most effective strategy to getting it done. It's a different story if what you want is credit for something, right? And those two things don't always go hand in hand. I wish that they did, but I don't think there's a magical fix around that. What can help is allies, right? So if we have, and I didn't talk about sponsorship today, so sponsorship is different from mentorship. Sponsorship is saying, hey, I got asked to write a commentary for this manuscript, will you write it with me? Or I got asked to be on this panel, but I don't want to go to that meeting. Can you go in my place? Or I got asked to give a talk, can you give it in my place? Turns out that men are more likely to receive sponsorship than are women. And so that's another thing that men can do as allies, is to sponsor women more. But I don't think there's a really good way around what you described. Do you?
We'd be here too long. All right, Andrew, last one.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. Very interesting. I'm just wondering, based on your own knowledge, are there any countries or cultures that are less implicitly biased than others?
So I don't know about the implicit bias, but
against gender, yeah.
World Economic Forum puts out a gender equality report every year, and they rank countries based on things like pay equity and parental leave policies. By the way, when I was mentioning maternity, usually I'm talking about parental leave. It's not just that women should get leave. Actually, any parents, birthing or non-birthing, should get leave and take it. But so they look at those types of measures and also how much people are paid on their parental leave. Anyway, all these things, and they rank the countries. And most years, Iceland and Finland are really up at the top. So we could all move there. That could be a solution. But we might muddy their waters. I don't know. Yeah.
Wonderful talk, Dr. Salles. Just to sort of give a plug sort of back to what was said at the beginning, that we know that there's a problem at UC Davis, just like there is everywhere else. And there's actually a training that you can take here that they've developed called seed trading to start to learn your own implicit bias. So that's a way that you can actually start to look into this and look at it for yourself. So.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. The only thing I would just point out as a caveat is that the data on implicit bias trainings are quite mixed on the whole. Some seem to be effective, others seem to have the opposite effect of basically saying like, oh, well, everybody's biased, so I'm fine. So just to know that they're informational, they could be educational, they probably will not change your world without further intention and structural change to follow.
All right.
It's so hard.
Yeah, it's such an important topic.
Do one more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salles, for your very interesting talk. I'm a surgeon at the VA, so I'm outnumbered in terms of the surgeon. Yeah, everything. Thank you. And I think I want to encourage all of us, but especially myself, to be a better proponent, better advocate for our residents. So often I find myself simply responding to and defending myself against the patients. You know, the other day, after I said, "Oh, I'm Dr. Grace, I'm here to talk about your hernia," 5 minutes later, "Are you a surgeon? Are you a doctor?" "Yes, I'm a surgeon." I go out, he looks at my ring finger, says, Mrs. Grace? And I just was so taken back. And really what I should do also is, instead of just focusing on myself, try to empower my residents and say, "No, this is Dr. So-and-so. This is going to be your surgeon." And I think that's going to not only try to teach the patients one at a time that it's really a culture change and something that they have to shift, but also empower the residents to say, we need to be stronger in terms of how we respond to these discrimination and harassment
Right, no, I agree.
statements.
And I think as faculty, we are in a position where we often see or hear about different things that are said to our trainees, and they may not feel like they can say anything. And yeah, it's nice if people can speak up for themselves. But again, sometimes, especially when there's a hierarchy and they're worried about their evaluation or what that patient's going to say to you when you walk in the room, we are in a better position sometimes to intervene in that way. And this is another thing that's actually really good for the men in the room is if you were ever a medical student, right, and you walked into a room with a woman as an attending, I'm sure that patients were looking to you. That happens all the time. And there are appropriate ways to redirect. You know, when they ask you as the medical student or the junior resident whether you agree with the attending's plan or what your plan would be, you know, you can say, well, actually, I'm training under this person, and I would really defer to Dr. So-and-so, you know. And that's an opportunity that the men have that's different from what the women have.
So thank you for this great conversation, and mostly thank you for bringing rigor to a really difficult conversation that I think you have helped legitimize, if you will, the conversation by the incredibly rigorous and detailed work that you do, referenced and analyzed, and it really an excellent leader for and an excellent voice for this conversation that's really important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.